All right, welcome back. The Kremlin's crackdown on anti-Putin protesters stretches into its third week now. The wife of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is paying the price herself. She was fined for joining the protest after her husband's imprisonment. More than 5,000 people were arrested during this latest round of demonstrations over the weekend. Russia continues to crack down on Navalny supporters in Moscow and in St. Petersburg and elsewhere. They are calling on President Putin to resign. Local Russian media reports that around 80 journalists were also arrested this weekend. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken told NBC News he's, quote, deeply disturbed.
The Russian government makes a big mistake if it believes that this is about us. It's not. It's about them. It's about the government. It's about the frustration that the Russian people have with corruption, with kleptocracy. I wanted to spend a few minutes with...
But they're clearly testing the new administration. And joining us now to talk more about this is decorated combat veteran, DoD advisor, and Newsmax contributor Cory Mills. Cory, great to talk to you.
Great to see you again, John.
All right, so what can only be described as Russian stormtroopers took to the streets yesterday, arresting Navalny's family, his supporters, and journalists, all because, mostly because Russia is in a terrible state of economic problems right now, and the people really see right through Vladimir Putin's game here. What do you think ultimately happens? Because Navalny certainly has boxed Putin into a corner.
Well, John, I would tell you that this right here isn't something that we haven't seen before. We know that Vladimir Putin has targeted his political opposition in the past, even poisoning some of his political opposition and opponents. We know that utilizing that autocrat kind of dictatorship is something that's very common within Russia. So I don't see this widespread protest being able to make any change. I think that the Kremlin will eventually stomp it out. It's interesting, however, this targeting of political opposition. I mean, I hate to say this, but we're seeing it in our own country where Democrats were, for example, making political targeting lists to say, hey, no employer should hire anyone who is a former Trump appointee. We should censor certain media, even certain media attacking Newsmax, because they're on a different scale of trying to tell the truth in journalism. So I hate to say it, but I'm seeing some of these same tactics being utilized in American soil today. So I'm not real optimistic at the moment.
I mean, the questions of suppression, censorship, those are real issues, certainly to take a look at. Also, some of the protesters we've seen, Cory, they're holding up toilet brushes over there in Russia. This is interesting. This is to mock Putin's lavish lifestyle after Navalny's foundation released the Putin Palace documents. They claim they had secretly built a coastal palace that contained, among other things, $824 golden toilet brushes. Now, again, you mentioned this. Putin's been able to squash these kinds of protests before. We've seen them over and over again. But the anger, I think, is something different here this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hilarious. The toilet brush revolution, as they're calling it, is coming forward. And again, this is the same thing that you see in a lot of dictators and tyrannical rules. We saw the same type of thing, living this lavish lifestyle while the average person basically suffers in poverty. We've seen it under Gaddafi, under Saddam Hussein, under many of the actual dictator leaders. I do think that they're going to continue to try and uprise. But again, you got to think about Putin, coming back from a former KGB member. He, went from being president to prime minister, essentially puppet playing with Medvedev, and then back into the fold. So he knows how to circumvent his constitution. He knows how to basically go ahead and stamp out his opposition. And it's not going to change with regards to his lavish lifestyle.
One of the other things, too, that's been a little disappointing about this has been the lack of a real firm response from our European friends, Germany for one, other countries as well. They're so dependent on energy from Russia that they really are unwilling to stand behind the Russian people, aren't they?
That's exactly right. It's really funny that, the Germans and French wanted to go ahead and attack President Trump during his time in the office on trade imbalances and trying to ensure that the America First rights were there and looking at human rights atrocities in China and other areas to hold our adversaries accountable. And, they were very quick to try and go after and target the establishment here. Meanwhile, they're being exceptionally quiet because they're looking at how does this benefit them? Right. It's starting to become a big hypocrisy about the UN and NATO when they wouldn't look at JCPOA as a violated resolution, and they won't hold Russia accountable so they can get something, but they attack the United States for some of our actions.
Right. It's interesting also to look at this through the lens of history and look at what happened with the incursion into Crimea and, eastern Ukraine. There was a lot of, propository back then that the people of that area, they actually might welcome the Russian invasion, but we know that's not the case. We know that's not the case, and we have the same people now handling foreign policy here in America that were handling it the last time, and the question is, do we expect things to be different? And I don't, but we'll look and see what happens with that, Cory. I also want to talk, too, about the fact that American taxpayers are spending a lot of money to keep Guantanamo Bay open right now, and that includes $161 million to house suspected mastermind of the 9/11 terror attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And up until this weekend, the Pentagon was planning on vaccinating him ahead of millions of Americans. They did pause that plan here. But, Cory, this comes from a New York Times article, which really kind of opened our eyes to this story here. But, you know, to President Obama's credit, he did talk about closing Gitmo. And now we look at this, the amount of money we're spending on this, and we have to ask the question, does it prevent terrorism? I don't know. Is it keeping us safer? I think that's still an open question. Why is Gitmo still open?
Well, I think that for the most part, when Gitmo originally opened, it was an area that we could try and go ahead and gather further intelligence to help to thwart any further attacks, to try and look at what the actual mastermind's plans were, to try and look at how we can forecast terrorist plans. It certainly had a good approach with regards to interrogation and being able to try and get that intel. However, when you've got a guy who's been arrested since 2003, and here we are in 2021, I don't know that he's really in the folds of what is taking place internationally with regards to terroristic attacks. So I think that it's a waste of taxpayers' money. I think that we need to go ahead and look at how we could shut down Gitmo if we're not getting the intel that we really require. And I think that we need to look back into our IC communities to look at ground sourcing, which is the same thing that we used to utilize with clandestine operations in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it's also a reminder, too, Cory, you know, these things start as, you know, good ideas perhaps, or an important thing to the mission at the time. But you know, this is one example of many that we see in our government and our military of things that never go away.
That's right. And again, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was a mastermind for the 9/11 attack. He's admitted to that.
Right.
You know, think about it from an American perspective. If I murdered 5 or 10 people and I came forward and said, hey, yeah, I did these things and I admitted to it, would I spend 20 years being taken care of and provided for and having my coronavirus shot? Of course not. I would have been sentenced to death long ago, and it wouldn't have been at any further taxpayer expenses. The fact that we're doing this in Gitmo, allowing 21 years of continuation, is absolutely absurd.
It is. Cory Mills, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.